this smoothed out on the planishing hammer. They're sitting nice and flat. So now I'm going to make my pattern for the skirts. So I'm going to put this edge right where I want the skirt to start. And I'm going to want some material down here, so I'm just going to angle it up a little bit. Myself plenty of paper. First, I'll just trace this inside the fender. Just like that. Then I'll grab a straight edge and just roughly shoot a line like that. Now I'm going to get this cut out and I'm going to tape it to the fender, and now I'll bring it over to the bike. We'll set it on the bike and start checking out what kind of radius we want to put in here. Got a rag in here. I got the fender sitting right about where it's going to be mounted, and just taking a look at it, I think I want to transition nice off this angle like that. Around there. Alright, and I'll probably do a little radius down in this area just to make it nice and clean. I think that'll work. So now I'll take it back over to the bench and I'll show you how to make this mess I just scribbled nice and clean. Okay, so here's a little scribble I just made, but it gives me enough information I need about where I want that cut. So a little trick I use to lay out smooth curves for something like this where it's long is I got 2 pieces of aluminum here. Anything heavy will work. And flexible steel ruler. And the cool thing about this is it bends very even. So I'll stick it on against those chunks of aluminum. Kind of bend it with one hand. Get the curve right where I want it. Trace the line. Now I'll do the same thing going the other way. That looks pretty good. Now right in here, I'll do radius and I think this will work. So, get this cut out, we'll bring it back over to the bike, see how it looks. I checked the fit on the bike and I'm happy with the shape, so I'm getting ready to cut this out of metal. So I got on here and I traced the outline with the Sharpie. Now before I cut this out, there's a few things to keep in mind. This is the edge where it gets welded to the fender. Now I want to make sure that it has a really good tight fit, and this paper pattern isn't perfect for that fender. I rough cut out with scissors just while we were working on the shape. So when I cut this, I'm going to leave probably about between 1/8 and 1/4 inch around this perimeter. And what I'll do is I'll clamp it overlapped right to the fender and then scribe one crisp line to trim on. That way I get a good fit to the fender. Another place I want to make sure I leave material is in this section. This comes to this real tight point and the weld seam is going to be coming right here. So while I'll trim the rest of this pretty good before it's on the fender, I'll cut it out close and then I'll get a pair of snips. I'll trim this line nice before I weld it up because it's going to be much easier to trim it off the fender. But right here I'm going to leave material starting about here to about here, because once I start welding that, the heat's going to build up in this little tip of metal and it's going to want to burn away on me and cause me problems. So I almost leave a little bit of extra here like a heat sink. So I'll weld this up and then once it's welded, I'll trim away this little bit right there. Alright, I got my skirt cut out of metal. I decided last minute to put a little bead detail along the bottom edge. I only have a cheap Harbor Freight bead roller, so I wasn't sure how I was going to go. But it worked out all right, and I think it's going to be a nice detail when it's done. So I've got some glue layout fluid on here. I'm going to get it clamped up and scribe my cut line. So I'm just looking for my Sharpie through the layout fluid. There we go. Alright, so we grab my scribe that I just lost. There it is. Alright. I don't know if you can see it, but one crisp line. And now when I cut this, I'm going to cut exactly to the line. Doesn't need to be straight, it needs to be whatever this is. So I'll cut that and we'll get it fitted up and welded on. And I'll show you how I'm going to pattern this side to ensure the other side looks exactly the same. Alright, I've got both sides tacked in place. I'm liking the look. I'm happy to put in this bead detail. I think when the Fender's all finished, it's going to be really nice. So this was the first side I did that I made the original pattern off of, welded it on. Now, in a perfect world, you'd be able to take the same pattern and just pop it on this side. And if you did a good job, you could see it's close. But these flanges on both sides aren't going to be perfect without work. We did shrinking and stretching and planishing on them. So they changed in surface area and they get wavy. One gets a little bit longer than the other. So just flipping over this pattern and welding it on, you might be a little off from side to side. So what I like to do is I take something that is known. I know that this curve right here, this arc, should be about the same on both sides because I used my buck and I made that profile gauge to make it. So what I do is I make another pattern and I base it off of this top arc. Then when I go to the other side, I lay it on there and I use that in addition to this blank, this original pattern, to make sure I get both sides to end the same spot where I need them to. I hope I explained that well. So now the next step is to finish seam welding this. Then I'm going to hammer and dolly the weld to finish out the weld. I've shown that in other videos. We'll trim off this excess and see how it looks. I want to give you guys a good tight view of the weld bead profile. You can see it sits nice and flat. Very little filler was added to the weld as welding because that's what you want. You don't want a tall weld. You want good fusion with a weld that lays nice and flat. Flip it over. I'll try to give you a view of the back side here to show you the penetration I managed to get. I hope you can see that. But full penetration all the way through. So on this side, this weld doesn't need anything. It's ready to planish. I'm going to hammer right on this weld, no grinding, nothing like that. On this side, I had two little spots where my gap was a little wide and I had to add a little bit more filler than the rest of the weld. And what I do on those spots, you can see right here, is I just take the high spot off that bead. I bring it down to where the rest of the bead is. I don't touch the metal around it. I just knock down the high spot. And that's it. So now this side's ready to planish also. I also wanted to point out, if you take a look at my heat affected zone, I have nice even heat input all the way through the panel. I started on one end, basically didn't stop, welded straight through the other end, kept everything nice and even. Same thing on both sides. That's what you want, nice even heat input. So if you take a look, we have some distortion. What happens is when your weld cools, it heats up, it expands, and when it cools, it shrinks, and that pulls it in. So now when we planish out this weld, not only are we flattening the bead, but we're also stretching that weld back up, and we're going to fix that distortion. So I'll show you guys how I do that. Grab my sandbag, drop it right in, turn it over, we'll work on this side first. Okay, I got my dolly. This is a heavy dolly, it's got a nice flat spot. Grab my hammer, and I'm just going to work right on the bead, putting some up pressure with my dolly, and hammering straight on the bead. Now, it's distorted over here, but I'm not going to hammer there, I'm not going to hammer up here. I'm only going to hammer where I welded, because everything was good before we welded it. So don't hit someplace else. Don't try to bang this up or pull it up. Just hammer that out, let it stretch out, fix that shrinking and distortion, and you'll see the panel come right back to where we had it. Crush it down pretty good, finish it out. I don't know if the camera's picking it up, but you could already see this is straightening out. This was dipped down hard and it's already starting to come up. Take a little bit more, just a couple of spots, and then switch to the other side. Look at that, looks pretty good. Let's flip it over, do the other side. Now that the welds are planished out on both sides, sitting nice and flat, got our fender shape back. Got my DA here with some 80 grit paper. Let's clean up this weld and shrink area, nice and light, just to make it look more like a professional finished product. I hit this quick with the DA, 80 grit, and I just went over it with some red Scotch-Brite. And I did a little hammer and die work where I saw a couple low spots I brought up. And feels pretty good. You can bring this to any painter. No one's going to scoff at this. I mean, this finish is more than acceptable. But I think I want to take it to the next level for the sake of the video. So I'm going to cut it in half. Here it is. I quickly measured center, used tape to pull a straight line, and then just cut it in half with the jigsaw. If you're doing something like this, you don't want to cut it with anything that's going to throw a bunch of heat into the panel. So don't use a cutting disc, don't use a plasma cutter, anything like that. Something like the jigsaw, a bandsaw, if you have a nibbler, that works out really well. So why did I do this? Well, now I can put these faces in the planishing hammer and get a nice finish on it. Could I finish these by hand, file finish them hammer and dolly? Absolutely. There are some guys, especially in Europe, in Australia, that are just masters at hand finishing panels. However, these start out as 18 gauge, shrunk a lot down to 16 gauge. Finishing these by hand is going to take forever, ton of work. So I'm going to jump over, put them in the planishing hammer, get them finished up nice, and then I can weld this right back up. I'm not worried about that because then I can put it in the planishing hammer or the English wheel, have access to this weld, planish it out nice, you'll never even know it was there. So let's go jump on the planishing hammer, get these cleaned up. All welded back in one piece, and you can see these sides finished out real nice in the planishing hammer. You can still lightly see some of the shrinking marks. I'm not even going to bother sanding those out. I mean, the surface is nice and smooth. I got a nice thick material there. There's no need to mess with that. So I'm really happy with that. Cutting this thing in half, doing it in a planishing hammer and welding it back up was faster than it would have taken me to do one side by hand. So it's definitely worth it. If you're good at welding, you know how to handle distortion just like we did on the sides. I mean, there's no problem cutting something in half like this. So now to finish this out, I'm going to jump on the English wheel, planish out this weld, it'll basically disappear, and I think this thing will be done. That's a wrap on this one. I'm happy with the result. I think it's going to look great on the bike when it's done. Thanks for checking out the video. I hope you guys learned something. It's like 100 degrees in the shop. I'm going to get out of here. See you on the next one.